link to a Google Doc, and that's where you can just complete that. But that's all you need to do. It's basically just giving your feedback and answering a few questions. Okay, everyone, it is 7 o'clock. So, welcome back, everyone, to Module 2. So, I hope you've had an opportunity to reflect on what we discussed in Module 1. And, maybe thinking about the plants and the, ecological communities around your home and your community a little bit more after what we were talking about. So tonight we're going to be looking more closely at one of the most important contributors to biodiversity, and that's our native plants. And as we discover, you know, what does it actually mean to be a native plant? And we're going to be finding that it's a little bit more nuanced than it appears, that idea, and it involves geography, evolution, ecology, and even a bit of history. And I'm also excited that later this evening, and she's here already, and that is Dr. Pamela Soltis. So excited you're here and that she was willing to join us. And she'll be sharing her expertise on the evolution and biological diversity of Florida's fauna, and her expertise and what makes these plants native. So before we dive in, I'd like to just look at our goals for this evening. We're going to be defining what makes a plant native, what's the difference between native, endemic, non-native, naturalized, and invasive plants. Explain why these distinctions matter when it comes to conservation, restoration, and our own landscaping, and to think about how the native flora developed here in Florida in terms of evolution and environmental change, and that will be by Dr. Pam Soltis. Let's move to the next page. So before we start talking about the definitions, I'd like you to think about this question for just a moment, and that is, what makes a plant native? And you can just put it in the chat box. What if you were talking to a neighbor or a family member and they said, "Hey, why do you care about native plants, or what is a native plant?" What would you say? Yeah, a plant that was historically here. Plants that grew up here in Florida, like me, Amy, that's cute. Naturally grows in areas, thrives in Florida climate. All right, so there's a lot of different answers, and all of these are really great. Often people will say it's a native plant is one that naturally grows here in Florida. Others may be thinking of a native plant as it relates to benefiting wildlife. And some people may just wonder, what makes a native plant native to one part of Florida and why another. But these are exactly the kind of questions we're going to be asking tonight. And also, I forgot to mention, we are going to be having moderator's choice of the 3 best comments and or questions. So please participate in the chat. And then the 3 that Rebecca chooses, she'll discuss at the end of the meeting. And I will send you a little gift because you guys know that I love doing that. I really like going to the post office and sending things. So, all right, let's move on. All right, so what makes a native plant native? The scientific definition of that. A native plant is a species that occurs naturally in a particular region and arrived there without human introduction. So at first glance, that seems pretty straightforward, but as we'll see, every part of that definition matters. So there's 2 essential parts to this. A native plant occurs naturally in a particular region, but native is always going to be tied to a specific place. So it's always going to be tied to a specific place. So it's not just simply native or non-native, it's native to somewhere. And that took me a while to understand when I first started with native plants. I thought, if you went on FAN, the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, you could just grab a plant from one of those nurseries and you're good. And then quickly I learned that no, there are some plants that are specific to Pinellas County, and not only Pinellas County, but I'm in a sand scrub habitat. So, and we'll learn about that as things go along. So, also, the plant arrived there without human introduction. So it typically was established through natural processes rather than human activities, whether those activities were intentional or accidental. So, um, you know, that definition immediately raises several questions. What do we mean by a particular reason? Or I'm sorry, region. What do scientists do? How do scientists determine whether a plant arrived naturally? And what happens when humans move plants beyond their natural range? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So native to where? Um, a native plant is considered native. It always depends on the geographic area being considered. So one of the first questions when you're talking with native plant people is native to where? So for instance, the southern magnolia is native to Florida, but it's not native to California. The plant itself hasn't changed, but what has changed is the place that we're talking about. And so the key idea I'd like you to remember is native describes the relationship between a species and a place. So that's just kind of a foundational idea that we want you to remember. So how do we decide what place that we're talking about? So scientists, land managers, and restoration ecologists think about native plants at several different geographic scales, depending on the question they're trying to answer. We might begin broadly by asking, first of all, is a species native to North America? Then we may narrow that focus to the southeastern United States, or more commonly for us, to the state of Florida. But we can become even more specific, kind of like what I was mentioning. Florida contains a remarkable diversity of ecoregions, like we talked about last week, and natural communities. And each of those has its own climates, soils, hydrology, and ecological conditions. And so as a result, a species may be native to Florida, but naturally occur only in certain parts of the state because of the environmental conditions it requires, and they're found only in that specific place. So for example, like a plant from my yard, that my yard's pretty much like sand scrub habitat, it would rarely occur. I don't think it could occur, honestly, in the wetlands, even though both of those habitats exist within Florida. So that's very important. And so thinking about those different geographic scales, it helps us to make better decisions about conservation, ecological restoration, land management, and selecting the right native plants for a particular site. So whenever possible, we want to choose native plants that are naturally adapted to the environmental conditions of the site where they'll be growing. And this means looking beyond whether a plant is just simply native to Florida and considering whether it naturally occurs in the same kind of habitats where we plan to use it. And so one tip I often give my friends and family is what I do is I go to state parks and I will try to find out like what my yard looks like. Is it hammocky? Do I have a lot of oak trees? Is it shady? In my case, it's like full sun, very white sandy soil. And so I will go to the Lake Wales Ridge, or I'll go to my local nature preserve and I go to a habitat that looks similar and I'll see which plants grow there and then I'll put them in my yard. Some people will adjust their soil in their yards to accommodate plants that might not naturally occur there. So that's an option too. But that's something to consider. Okay, so as we go through the course, we're going to be encountering several terms that are closely related but have very specific scientific meanings. And so we're going to briefly introduce each one. So, like I said earlier, a native plant occurs naturally in a region without human introduction, typically. An endemic plant is even more specialized. It is native to a particular place and is found nowhere, naturally, nowhere else on Earth, or maybe just a few places. Like at the preserve where I worked, we had a plant called Nuttall's rayless goldenrod. It was just a very simple plant. You probably just would have walked over it if you hadn't, didn't know it was endangered. But there was only one other place in Florida. So, but it's endemic to those two places. And non-native, sometimes called an introduced or exotic plant, is one that people have moved beyond its natural range. Some non-native plants become naturalized, meaning they establish self-sustaining populations in the wild without continued human assistance. And then a small percentage of naturalized plants become invasive. And we will be having a speaker towards the end of the course who speaks specifically about native, or I'm sorry, invasives. So we'll go more into this later. But these species spread rapidly and cause ecological, economic, and human health impacts. And so, one important point to remember is that not all non-native plants become invasive. So you can be non-native, but you don't spread like crazy. And so we'll explore each of these categories in a little bit more detail. All right, so let's go back to non-native plants. It's very simply a species that occurs outside its natural range because of human activities. And so notice that this definition doesn't tell us whether the plant is good or bad. It simply tells us how it arrived. Being non-native is a description of a plant's origin, not a judgment about its value or behavior. People have moved plants around the world for thousands of years, and they continue to do so now. Some introductions are intentional. So some plants may be used for agriculture, landscaping, forestry, erosion control, or horticulture, and other introductions happen naturally. But obviously, we, as the Florida Native Plant Society, are promoting native because they're so much better than non-native. But you know, sometimes seeds will hitchhike in contaminated seed mixes on vehicles and equipment, on shipping containers. But the point is that this is human activity, not necessarily natural dispersal, what makes these species non-native to a particular region. Um, and so let's move on. The naturalized plant. So we learned about a non-native plant is one that people have moved beyond its natural range. And then what happens next depends on the species. Many introduced plants never survive outside of cultivation. So if people stop planting them, they may simply disappear. However, some are able to adapt to their new environment. They begin reproducing on their own and establish self-sustaining populations in the wild. And these species are called naturalized. They no longer depend on people for their survival. It's become, established in the landscape, even though it did not arrive there naturally. And so, again, naturalized does not mean invasive. Some naturalized species just remain stable and cause little or no measurable ecological harm compared to invasives. And we talked about invasives. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, invasive. So now we've reached the final category in this, and that is the invasive plants. It's not simply a plant that grows quickly or is difficult to control in a garden. In ecology, this term has a much more specific meaning. An invasive plant is a non-native species that establishes in natural areas, spreads beyond where it was introduced, and causes harm. And it's harm that separates an invasive species from one that is naturalized. So I just saw Kate say air potato, my arch nemesis. Yes, I have at the place where I work, we have so many invasives, it's not even funny. And one of my jobs is to first remove those. We have Caesar weed, carrot wood, Um, we have tuberous sword fern. I mean, I could go on, Brazilian pepper, on and on. So, would we have anyone else? What kind of invasive plants that have you been in contact with? I saw some Brazilian pepper. Oh yeah, rosary pea. Yep. Torpedo. Oh, I have torpedo grass in my yard. Bamboo. Yes. Caesar weed. Yeah, the Caesar weed, those seeds go everywhere and they Velcro in my hair. Chinese climbing fern. Yeah. Green shrimp plant. Cape honeysuckle. So yeah, Mexican petunia, melaleuca in the Everglades, camphor tree. Yeah, so we all have our experience with invasive plants. And I'll tell you just a quick story. So where I work, we have this little turtle pond next to this classroom. And it's been an exceptionally hot summer. And so when I arrived, I noticed that they had an invasive plant. It was hydrangea. No, it's not hydrangea. Sorry, I can't think of the name of it right now. But anyway, they had an invasive plant. And so I said, hey, we need to remove this. They took it off and then they put in a water lettuce, which is another invasive. And so they put like a little tiny bit just to provide a little bit of shade. I kid you not, within like probably 5 or 6 days, the entire pond was covered with that. And so every day I would go out and, kind of open up space so the turtles can move around. And it just keeps growing so fast. And I'm just like, you guys, we have to do something different. So we're going to put a native in there that we know is not invasive. Jan Allen said waterless may be native, not this one. Oh, but you're right. There, yeah, it could. Oh, you're saying it's debated in general. Oh, that's something new to me, Jan. Well, maybe I used the wrong example then, but you get my point. It's a plant that goes absolutely bonkers. Let's see what else. Elephant ears. If so, it can be considered aggressive. Okay, good point, guys. All right, let's see what else. Okay, so why does this matter? Why have we spent this time defining the terms? And it's because stewardship begins with understanding. The more we understand about what makes a plant native, if it's native, endemic, non-native, naturalized, or invasive, we're better informed, so we can we're better equipped to make informed decisions. So whether you're, choosing something for your own landscape or helping to restore a natural area, maybe you're volunteering with a conservation group like Keeping Elves Beautiful has been working, or educating others in your communities, concepts provide a foundation for good stewardship. So understanding what makes a plant native and why that matters helps us make informed landscaping and restoration decisions. So, how did Florida come to have such an extraordinary diversity of plants? To help answer this question, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Pamela Soltis. And maybe you can clarify things, Pamela, I'm not an expert like you. I'm hoping that I got things right, but if I didn't, please feel free to correct me. The whole point of this inaugural cohort is so that we can um, improve it. So I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. This was a great introduction to what to what I planned for our discussion, and I think you did a great job with it. So perfect on all of that. Yeah, so maybe I will go ahead with my screen. There we go. I'm assuming everyone can see this okay since the practice worked okay.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, Dr. Soltis. I forgot to give like a little bit of background. Would you mind if I just jump in real quick to like
Oh, that's
give
fine.
people an idea of who you are?
Okay,
Sorry, guys.
okay, that's fine.
Okay, so sorry, Dr. Solstice is a distinguished professor and curator at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida and serves as the director of the University of Florida Biodiversity Institute. Her research focuses on the patterns and processes of plant evolution, with particular emphasis on the evolutionary history of flowering plants and how their genomes have changed over time. Working with a team of collaborators, she helped to develop a framework of angiosperm phylogeny. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, which is the evolutionary relationship among flowering plants, and contributed to a classification system that is now used by botanists around the world. So, in simpler terms, Dr. Solstice studies how flowering plants are related to one another and how they have evolved over millions of years. Her work has helped scientists to better understand the plant family tree and the remarkable diversity of flowering plants that we see today. She also explores innovative ways to use herbarium specimens and their digital collections to answer important questions in evolutionary biology and ecology while actively working to make science more accessible to the public. So thank you so much, Dr. Solstice. I keep
Sure.
on saying solstice, solstice.
That's okay. Okay. Well, thanks again for the invitation and the opportunity to meet with all of you. I think this sounds like such an amazing program, and I'm really excited to be able to participate in this inaugural version of the course. So I've used as the title here, the title of the session, What Makes a Plant Native? And really what I'd like to do is touch on several of the points that Andrea made during the introduction. And so, by way of overview for my comments, I'd like to really emphasize Florida's iconic biodiversity. And this is, of course, something that none of us here really needs to be convinced of, but I think it sets the stage for how we think about Florida's plants, Florida's wildlife, and our responsibilities for stewardship and conservation. And of course, all of this biodiversity really relies on the fact that we have amazing plant diversity here. And so really the focus of my presentation will be on the plant diversity, how it arrived where it arrived, some of the properties of the environment that contribute to the distribution of our diversity. And then I'll switch to thinking a little bit more about some of the threats to Florida's plant diversity and how our plants may respond to climate change. And then ultimately what that means for Florida's biodiversity overall, and actually what that means for all of us in terms of, again, stewardship and conservation. So I'm hoping that the comments that I've prepared will sort of set you up for some of the topics that are going to be covered in the subsequent sessions as well. So I thought it would be good to just take a look at Florida plants by the numbers, is the way I like to think about this. And, you know, this changes pretty frequently. So when I gave a talk on a related topic, you know, maybe 10 years ago, there were actually different numbers here because even as well known as Florida's plants are, because there's so much diversity, there are also many opportunities for ongoing study. And so new species are being discovered all the time and named scientifically. So the number of species is changing in terms of our scientific understanding. And of course, we continue to be bombarded by non-native species. And so the most recent compilation that I could find is what I like to refer to the Florida Plant Atlas, compiled by the University of South Florida. And it lists 4,919 plant species, of which 3,319 are native and 1,600 are non-native. And not knowing that you were all going to get such a great introduction to what all of these different types of species were, I decided to explore multiple definitions for how to define a native plant species. And there are quite a few definitions out there, but I think this definition from the USDA Forest Service is pretty similar to what you were just introduced to, and also pretty similar to many of the themes that were popping up in the chat. So the USDA and Forest Service define native plants as the indigenous terrestrial and aquatic species that have evolved and occur naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, and habitat. And so this really ties the plants to a particular location. But I think several of you also indicated that there might be some sort of a temporal component to what makes a plant native. And that's also captured in some of the comments by the USDA. And they say that for North America, those species that occurred here prior to European settlement are the ones that we should consider to be native. Now, Florida's ecosystems are amazing. We have such diversity of ecosystems. And one of the things that I find so fantastic about living in Florida, and I know I'm not from Florida, I moved here in 2001, so I'm still learning all the time. But one of the things I find so fantastic is that there is so much diversity with such minute variation in environmental characteristics. And in fact, such small changes in elevation can mark the difference between some of the different habitats and ecosystems that you see here. So going from a wetland to almost a wetland to a ridge doesn't take that much elevation relative to other parts of the world. And certainly going from a wetland to a prairie is very, very small in terms of those elevational changes, because with the elevational changes come so many different aspects of drainage, soil, water retention of the soil, and so on. And of course, when many people think about Florida's biodiversity, they think of our iconic animals and wildlife, and here are just a few of those. But of course, all of this amazing wildlife is supported by our plant diversity. So I think it's only right that we really devote a lot of attention to Florida's plants when we're thinking about conservation issues and how to preserve and manage our ecosystems. So all of this diversity of Florida's plants is really related to attributes of the habitat and of the environment. And so just, some very obvious aspects of the habitat that help determine what makes a plant native to a particular location. These things have to do with temperature and precipitation, and not just the amount of precipitation, but the seasonality of the precipitation, also the temperature seasonality, the types of soil, the amount of elevation, as I mentioned before, and certainly our biotic interactions. What are the pollinators? What are the dispersers? What are the competitors? What sorts of biological interactions does a species have in a particular location, and what leads to a plant being able to survive in one location versus it being driven out by natural biotic interactions. So all of these things, and probably many others, contribute to what makes for a suitable habitat for any given species. And this will come back into play in a little bit when we start talking about how species might respond to various aspects of climate change. So in thinking about how to frame the distribution of Florida's plant diversity and also how it got to be the way it is, I started thinking about taking a bigger view, a larger landscape view of Florida, and putting it in the context of its regional distribution, some of the regional plant species, and so on. And I always like to think about the fact that it was only a little over 10 years ago, in 2015, that the North American coastal plain, this area marked in green with a little bit of gray toward the tips, was recognized as a global biodiversity hotspot. And this follows a particular definition of a hotspot. We often think of hotspots as just being areas with lots of locally restricted or at least endemic species. But in fact, there are some strict definitions for a global biodiversity hotspot. And these are that there are at least 1,500 vascular plant species and that the area has undergone a vast amount of loss of its historic vegetation cover. So more than 70% is what's used in these definitions. So by these criteria, with over 6,000 native vascular plant species, this region of the southeastern US qualifies as a global biodiversity hotspot. And if we really think about this relatively small area with such a huge number of native species, um, that just causes us to start asking lots of questions, especially when we think about other sorts of biodiversity hotspots. Now, typically people might think of an island archipelago or the Andes or some region where there's a lot of geographic diversity within that hotspot area. Such as mountain ranges or again islands or something that might be promoting rapid speciation and the accumulation of a lot of species. But here in the Southeast, most of our landscape is quite homogeneous. We don't see these same sorts of massive changes in elevation or other sorts of environmental attributes. And so this raises a lot of questions like, how do we have so many species in this area when we are living in a place that's relatively homogeneous? Of course, those of us who do live here know that there's a lot of diversity in our habitats, but it's much more minor than what we typically see in biodiversity hotspots. So a couple of our former students and some current ones as well, graduate students, have been focusing on some of these questions. And one of these former students, Tal Kinzer, was interested in the distribution of endemic species throughout the North American coastal plain. And so you can see here an outline by the colors, the shape of this region, and then the heat maps show from red very high levels of endemic species, and then in the cooler colors, low distributions. Now, this requires that we think about what the term endemic means or endemism. And interestingly, I had a meeting with a research group this afternoon, and we were also discussing the definition of this term because it's used in many different ways. In some cases, people use endemism to refer to anything that's native to a particular region. In other cases, it actually refers to species that are restricted to a particular region. So you could have a species that is relatively widespread, but still endemic to the North American coastal plain, or you can have species that are restricted to very specific regions of this coastal plain. So in Tal's work, he was more interested in this latter definition, those that are restricted to specific areas. And if you look at this map on the left, you'll see this very, very bright red region here and the around Apalachicola that is a super concentration of endemic species. And of course, for people who know their Florida plants, this is not a big surprise. But this is placed in the context then of the rest of the North American coastal plain. And then when Tal started investigating what some of the characteristics were from the environment that might shape this distribution, he found that it's the patterns of summer precipitation shown here in the upper right map with the red patterns there showing our typical southern precipitation patterns and also properties of the soil, the high percentage of sand. And the combination of those two environmental factors, more than anything else, predict that this region around Apalachicola would have this very high percentage of endemic plants. But it also contributes then to our understanding of the distributions of other plants in Florida as well. And we'll get to that more in just a minute. So another now former student of ours, Elizabeth White, she just got her PhD in May, has also been interested in species diversity in the North American coastal plain, and she's particularly interested in the region along the Gulf coastal plain. That is just the area that stretches from eastern Texas to northern Florida, and in this coastal region. And this is only about 7% of the land of the entire coastal plain region, but it has 25% of the species diversity. And part of the reason for that is that it encompasses that Apalachicola species endemism hotspot as well. So there's super high endemism here. It's an area that historically was dominated by fire, and there are slight changes in elevation. But Elizabeth was really interested in not just what's there now, but where did this diversity originate? And so this gets back at one of the questions that was raised for the beginning of this presentation. So Elizabeth surveyed all of the plants that were in this region. She looked into the literature to see what their closest relatives were, where their closest relatives occurred, what their paleobotanical history might be, if there was evidence for that. And she found that this region of this Gulf coastal plain has been the recipient of plant lineages that have come from all over the place. So, of course, some of the species that occur there originated right there in situ. So some of the species diversity has arrived from the North American coastal plain itself. But some of the species have actually come from other regions, or at least their lineages have. So there are a lot of species in this Gulf coastal plain region and in Florida more generally that have as their closest relatives other species from Eastern North America. And then, of course, during times of glacial advance and retreat, these plant species would be pushed south and then that would colonize northward again afterwards. But in many cases, once these species moved southward, they diversified in their new locations and became new species that then stayed in Florida rather than colonizing areas to the north again when the glaciers retreated. And so there are a lot of species that have originated from Eastern North America. That makes a lot of sense. Interestingly, there are also a lot of species that have arrived in our region, in the Gulf coastal plain in particular, from Western North America. So historically, there was a broad band of arid habitats that stretched from the southeast, from essentially along the Florida coast, across the Gulf coastal plain, past like through what's now Texas and northern Mexico, clear out to Western North America. And so some of our species in Florida, and particularly in this region, have as their closest relatives other species from Western North America. So those lineages also have contributed to our massive amounts of diversity here. And then, of course, you can imagine that there have been influxes of species from the Caribbean, from Central and South America. Certainly, certain species have been brought in naturally by hurricanes and storms, and they establish and are able to maintain their distributions in this region. And then the final region, and this is something that I think typically surprises people, is that there are a number of species in the southeastern US that have as their closest relatives species in China and other parts of Eastern Asia. And so from very long ago, there was a continuous forest between Eastern Asia and Eastern North America. And then eventually through climate changes millions and millions of years ago, these different floras became isolated, but some of the species in the southeastern US actually have their closest ties to Eastern Asia. So essentially this area of the Gulf coastal plain is like a melting pot where we have all of these different processes taking place. Let's see here. For some reason, my slides are not advancing now. There we go. So given that sort of history of where a lot of the species diversity has come from, TEL started taking another look at the regions of endemism more closely throughout this North American coastal plain. And so in addition to this region around Apalachicola, there's a region in the mid-Atlantic and another region here in the Florida Peninsula, which essentially covers just about all of Florida. So with the exception of a little bit of northern Florida and the southernmost area, we end up having a lot of endemic species. So that's a little bit about how we got the diversity that we have today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about like the different habitats and communities and things because I know that those are also on topics for some of your future sessions. But I wanted to sort of take this framework and start thinking about what some of the current and future threats might be to Florida's plants. And in doing so, I hope to introduce you to some of the tools that we use to understand both current distributions and also how we might be able to predict what future distributions might look like. So we've already heard a bit about invasive species. Those can certainly be problematic for any of our native species, because as they become established, they often will drive out some of our natives. And so that's a very important and very serious threat. The invasive species, in this case, I'm thinking in terms of invasive plant species, but other invasive species from other groups of organisms also present huge threats because they often carry disease. And so we can think about laurel wilt and the fact that it's killing many of our Lauraceae plants, but it's because of an introduced fungus that came in a beetle. So the introduced beetle is bringing this introduced fungus, and that fungus gets into our laurels, like at our bays, and that presents a really serious disease. And that's, of course, just one example. Another threat is changes in land use. We see this all the time as 1,000 people move to Florida every day, every sometime within every very short time frame. This requires home building, changes in land use, additional retail, all of the things that are needed to support this population. And so that, of course, is detrimental to our native plants as well. And then the final one that I'll mention is climate change. And this is where I'll spend quite a bit of the rest of my presentation. So land use, certainly we have changes from natural vegetation for changes for agriculture, for recreation, such as golf courses, for housing. And one of the big problems is that all of these changes in land use, particularly as we continue to urbanize, stifled the natural fire. And this fire is such an important part of our native Florida ecosystem. So many species depend on fire, sometimes for fruits to open, sometimes for seeds to germinate, and certainly for healthy weeding out, essentially, of some species that are actually native, but that will choke out some other species. So this is one of the big issues with land use, in addition to, of course, taking over the distributions. So these pictures are looking off toward Lake Wales Ridge, which we already mentioned earlier. And here, at least 84% of the natural areas have been converted into other sorts of land use. And this is despite the incredible plant diversity that's in that area. So all that we know about the plants of the Lake Wales Ridge is has been learned despite the fact that the amount of land in close to natural conditions is highly reduced. So, as I mentioned, I'd like to spend the next, probably the next bit and most of the rest of the talk on how Florida's plants will respond to climate change. And this really also gets at the question of how can we know? How do we understand what's happening to them, and how do we make predictions about the future? And the answer that I'll give you is one that might be a little bit of a surprise to you. That's that we can turn to the past. We can look to our museum collections, in particular in the case of plants. We can look to our herbaria as sources of information that will help us understand how they might be responding in the future. So how do we predict future plant distributions? Well, I've shown here a herbarium specimen from the University of Florida Herbarium. And our herbarium here has about 550,000 pressed, dried specimens, all on uniform sheets of paper like this. There's similar excellent herbaria at Florida State, at USF, and smaller regional herbaria at other institutions in the state as well, and at not just educational institutions, but at field stations like Archbold as well. And the thing about these herbarium specimens is that every specimen comes with a label, and then the label here is circled in red in the lower right-hand corner. And this label will give the species name, it will give the person who collected it, it will tell you the date that the specimen was collected, and probably most importantly, other than the name, it will tell you where that specimen was collected. And typically for older specimens, this will be a textual description of where the plant was collected, 5 miles down such and such a highway in the ditch on the side of the road or something like that. More recently, the specimens will all be marked with GPS coordinates. And the thing about those GPS coordinates, and you can get them either directly or by interpreting the textual information that's on the specimen, is that those GPS coordinates will allow us to place a specimen directly on a map. And by doing that, we're able to get some environmental information about where that specimen was collected. Now, of course, as I mentioned, we have some excellent herbaria in the state of Florida, and there's a lot of really valuable information about the history of plant distributions here and also more recent distributions. But what we were not able to do until the last 15 to 20 years is able to amass very much information about those specimens. Nobody's going to go sit in a herbarium and go through 550,000 specimen records and write down or type into a database where those species were distributed in order to do a research project. But thankfully, the U.S. National Science Foundation funded a huge project to digitize natural history collections. And so not all of the specimens in all of the collections, but many specimens in many collections across the country have now been databased and digitized and are captured in iDigBio, which is the hub housed here at the University of Florida for keeping track of all of these digitized specimens. There's also a global database called GBIF. This is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And databases like iDigBio feed into GBIF. And so similar sorts of efforts are taking place around the world. And GBIF now has records for hundreds of millions of specimens that have been collected from all over. Now, one of the other things that GBIF has is it also collects iNaturalist records. So the iNaturalist records that have been approved for research grade are also housed in GBIF. And that means that we can also have a lot more recent collections for a lot of species that we might not have herbarium specimens for. So basically, the combination of herbarium specimens and iNaturalist observations give us a lot of valuable information about what species occur where and what their environmental characteristics are. So as I mentioned, we can use GPS coordinates to place a specimen directly on a map. So in this case, we can place this specimen somewhere in the panhandle, approximately where I put the red dot. So the cool thing about that is that there are other databases of environmental variation that allow us to say, let's take a look at that red dot. What are the characteristics of the environment at that particular location? And if we do that, we can get climatic information, temperature, precipitation, elevation, a lot of characteristics like that. And we can also get soil information, all because this other information is also digitized and available free of charge globally to anybody in the world. So we can take that environmental information for every specimen and we can ask for a species, what are the overall characteristics of the environment that make for a suitable habitat for that species. And we can do that by using some modeling framework. So we take our specimens, we get our spots, we use our climate data, we use our soil data, and then we do some ecological modeling to find out the best distribution or the best set of characteristics to describe the distribution of a species. And once we do that, we can start asking how the distribution of a species might change in the future under climate change. So let's use an example to illustrate how this might work. So here's the dogwood, Cornus florida. And if we look at the distribution map by county from the Florida Plant Atlas, we get this map like up here in the upper right where we see which counties their specimens reported from. And then if we look at where there are herbarium specimen records for Cornus florida, we get this map in the lower left. So every one of those dots is a herbarium specimen for a location. And we can take all of that information, get the environmental characteristics, get the soil, et cetera, and then we can develop a model. And that model will tell us how that species, where that species might occur in relation to other habitats in Florida. And here in the lower right, I have some of the forest habitats silhouetted out. And those are where this dogwood species would occur, would be in some of those locations. So we can use a model like that to say, okay, this model describes the current distribution of the dogwood in Florida. And then we can ask how the species might respond to climate change. So I'm going to use a couple of different examples here. First of all, the flat spike sedge. Now, if we use that same approach and we ask what the characteristics are for the habitat and where do they occur, we would find that based on where the warm colors appear in this map, we have this little region of South Florida, which has the correct habitat characteristics for the flat spike sedge. Of course, this is not a really great place to be a plant, given the location here. So, but if we're just considering the climatic and environmental characteristics, that would be its location. But we can take a look at what the characteristics are going to be like in Florida in 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, based on some climate models that have been developed. And we can see here in 2050, there are no warm colors left represented here, indicating that there will not be any suitable habitat. And this doesn't take into account sea level rise. It doesn't take into account urbanization or anything. It just has to do with a shift in those climatic characteristics that can be measured from precipitation, temperature, elevation, soil, et cetera. But that's not all that gloomy. If we look at the scrub plum, we can see that its greatest potential habitat for the current time is here in Central Florida along Lake Wells Ridge. And in the future, when we expect a hotter, drier Florida, it will have the potential to have expanded its distribution dramatically. Of course, nobody thinks that in 25 years, this little plant is going to be able to cover all of those warm colored areas in Florida. But what this indicates is that there will be habitat matching the climatic characteristics for the species that will occur much more broadly. So if we summarize this information this is just 1,500 of our current species. We have another student who's just about finished with her dissertation who's redone this work for all, well, for about, for all of the 3,300 native species, but this is for about half of them. We did this a few years ago. These areas in green are high species diversity. The areas in tan are lower species diversity. And we expect there to be some changes between now and 2050, where the green areas represent regions where there will be increases in species numbers and the tan areas decreases. So you can see that a number of these regions, particularly along the Western Peninsula, but also along the Panhandle, are expected to not have suitable habitat for a large number of species. So we've taught some courses on this topic over the last few years, and the whole goal of the course is to provide research experiences for students, real authentic research for undergraduates, most of whom were freshmen. The first of these efforts was to ask a question about where Florida scrub species are going to find suitable habitat in the course of changing climates. And this just shows briefly the species richness maps for scrub species, with the greatest species richness here in the Lake Wales Ridge and varying much lower species richness elsewhere in the peninsula, but also along the coasts, both along the Panhandle coast and along the Atlantic coast. So this was a study of 36 species, and I'll just show you a few of these maps just as illustrations. So that was the current situation. If we go to the future, we still see these same areas, the blue and green here in the northern peninsula, the Lake Wales Ridge in red. But there are some species that for which the habitat will no longer be suitable. And that's using just sort of a moderate climate change between 2041 and 2060. The map on the right is later in the century, and we see a greater loss of species diversity in the Lake Wales Ridge and up here in peninsular Florida, farther north. And we also show a 2-foot sea level rise along the coast here. And these are areas that would be blocked out from being suitable habitat for any terrestrial plants. And then we've more recently done a similar course looking at hardwood forests. And this was an analysis of 39 species. And you can see the current distribution maps here with the yellower colors here showing higher species diversity. And that same map is here on the left. And then in the future, there will be slightly less diversity, but also this shows the 2-foot sea level rise as well. And then changes in species richness, yellow representing losses of suitable habitat in the map on the left. And then on the right, just showing how these forest communities mostly fail to overlap with management zones. And so despite having these beautiful forest communities, most of them do not fall within management regions. So those were just some ways that we have been looking both at overall Florida species diversity and how it might respond to climate change. Also, specific community types like the scrub habitat, and then also the mesic forests and how they might respond to changes in temperature and precipitation. Soil and elevation will stay the same, but biotic interactions we also would anticipate would change a lot, like what's going to happen to pollinators in the future. So and those are not at all included in the development of these models. So one question everybody always asks about, though, is the impact of sea level rise on Florida's plants. And this map shows different levels of sea level rise and what the impacts will be along the coasts and much farther inland. And of course, all of these impacts will lead to loss of coastal habitat, loss of coral reefs, all with great ecological and economic consequences, but losses of lots of terrestrial habitats and species as well. One of the final messages that I also want to make clear is that there's a potential mismatch of the current distributions and optimal habitats. So um, some of our species will have optimal habitats in new locations, but they won't have any way to get there. So what does that mean in terms of stewardship and conservation? What sorts of assisted migration might we want to consider in helping to maintain some of our communities in the future? We also know that changes in climate are likely to increase the impact of invasive plants. Some of you mentioned both of these in the chat earlier. And one of the other things that's predicted to happen is that Florida's plant communities are likely to become much more homogenized. So as species have a harder time surviving in a given area, there may be more other species that will have the opportunity to spread. And so there's a likelihood that our very distinct Florida ecosystems may become much more homogenized in the future. And this, of course, has consequences not just for our botanical life, but also for wildlife in leading to loss of habitat, food, nesting sites, and protection. So the bottom line here is that Florida's ecosystems are already changing, and they're changing quickly. And this means that conservation and management should actually be planning for the climate of the future, not for the climate of today. And we see this sort of perspective being adopted by certain conservation organizations, by certain restoration and landscaping organizations, and by the governments of certain states and provinces in Canada, for example, as well. And so I think this program that you're all embarking on is a great opportunity to think about how we can look to the future and think about what the best directions are for conserving and managing not just plant diversity, but Florida's biotic diversity in general. And so I'd just like to thank lots of folks who've contributed to all of the work that I showed here today. Also, I tried to indicate who the sources of the photos were. Thanks to the National Science Foundation and to iDigBio for providing so many great resources for conducting this research. And I'd be happy to take some questions if we have time.
Yes, so thank you, Dr. Solstice, so much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. I'm really grateful that you were willing to spend some time with us, and you bring up such fascinating ideas, many of which, we probably don't think about enough. So at this time, Rebecca is going to field the questions, and she will ask them of you, Dr. Soltis, and then after that time, she'll select the three top questions and or comments. All right, Rebecca, go for it.
P. Mullins asked, how can genetic testing of plants, fungi, etc., help scientists understand where plants have come from and endemism in Florida?
Oh, wow. Great question. How much time do you want for an answer on that one? So that's actually part of what our lab focuses on in terms of our research. So a portion of it has to do with this modeling work that I described tonight, but another part really has to do with genotyping local plant species and putting them in the context of a bigger family tree for plants. And by putting them into these family trees, and this is what Elizabeth did with her work in the Gulf Coastal Plain, you can find out who the closest relatives are, and then you can figure out who, based on who the closest relatives are, what their ancestral distribution might have been. And then you can start hypothesizing about how things got to be where they are. That also means you can start looking at those close relatives as maybe sources of traits and things that might be necessary if you have a species that's highly endangered. So, for example, with the American chestnut, there are some very interesting genetic studies that are being done with the closest relative of that, which occurs in China, to find disease resistance genes that can then be plugged into the native chestnut species. And so by knowing by using genetics to find the closest relatives and then using the closest relatives as sources of information, we can, I think, really learn a lot more about the history and the origins of our species, and also, in some cases, how best to protect them.
Michelle Anaya from Suncoast asks, how can predicted future plant distributions be used to decide which habitats should be protected or restored today?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's something that a number of organizations are grappling with, and I think it's really exciting to see that sort of perspective being adopted. Several years ago, I was participating in a conference, and I learned that the forestry department for the province of British Columbia in Canada was actually using climate predictions and future predictions of species distributions to think about where they were going to reforest and how they were going to reforest following as part of their timber industry. So they were planning for the future economically, not entirely for habitat restoration, but they were taking this information into account. Now, of course, the models are only as good as the information that goes in. And so there's a lot of effort being devoted to improving our capacity for modeling, and also for the types of data that we can use in those models. I've participated in some workshops with FAN. Andrea mentioned FAN earlier. So there's some interest there for among landscapers and city planners to think about planting trees that are not the trees that they would use now, but trees that would be able to handle their climate of the future. And so there are definitely some efforts going forward. With regard to natural ecosystems, one of the things that we're always interested in is taking a look at where protected areas fall relative to the projected distributions of a large number of species, because if there's an area that is already in a managed habitat and a protected habitat, it may be that those are particular regions that could think more about future distribution. So there's a lot of opportunity for discussion here, and but it's really just getting started.
We have some terminology questions. David Roddenberry from Saracenia asks, what's the difference between the terms indigenous plant versus native plant? And Barbara Davis from Pawpaw asks, what is a noxious plant?
Great. So my own interpretation for native versus indigenous would mean that those would be, I would equate those. I think in that USDA Forest Service definition that they used indigenous to help define native. And so I think it's like, so that you're not saying it's native as a way of defining native, but I think it's it means occurs naturally. So I think that indigenous and native can be used interchangeably. I don't. Others may have different interpretations there. That would be important to share, I think, as well. And then noxious, I think, is that's one of those judgment calls, right? So not all introduced species or non-native species would be considered noxious, but some of them certainly become so. I think often the term noxious is used maybe equivalently to invasive, but I don't think it has to be as bad as invasive. I don't think of it as much as a scientific term, as a value judgment in terms of what you want in your neighborhood or in your park or something. But again, others may have other perspectives on some of those terms. Yeah, noxious is, I mean, I always think about noxious in terms of like a noxious weed, right? And often used in conjunction with agriculture. But I think other people might, you could have a noxious weed that's in your yard as well, I guess. Okay, so it's legal. I did not realize that. I know that some states will say this is a noxious weed in this state, and of course that's like slander in some cases, right? Because it's a plant that's native in another state. But yeah, that's good to know. Okay.
And C. Mullins also asks, how long does it take for a native species to adapt to a warmer climate?
So that's another question that a lot of people are really, a lot of scientists are working on right now. So one of the things that I think a lot of people are worried about is the fact that our climate is changing pretty rapidly, and plant species have been adapting to their local environments for thousands to millions of years. And so how would it possibly be possible for them to adapt quickly enough to a new habitat? But what people are finding is that it varies a lot on from group to group of plants. So like, for example, one group of plants that we've worked on, there aren't too many representatives in the Southeast. These are plants in a lot of them in the Pacific Northwest, et cetera. But anyway, their history goes back, their evolutionary history goes back to a time when their ancestors were all like cold adapted. And in fact, they've hardly made any migrations out of cold or sort of temperate habitats into hot habitats. And so it doesn't look like it's in the genetic makeup of that group of plants to be able to adapt to a highly warming environment. On the other hand, and you might think that it would be difficult for trees as well, right? Because they've got a long generation time, so their evolutionary processes will take much longer to grow to reproduction, make the seeds, all of that. So the whole adaptation process is much slower. But there are definitely some examples of very rapid adaptation that come about that have been documented in groups of plants like grasses and other and small herbaceous plants that have adapted to toxic soils that surround mines. And so there are new genotypes that have adapted to those sorts of areas over the course of a small number of generations. And there are also experiments showing that plants can adapt to, again, small, fast-growing herbaceous plants can adapt in some cases to a warming climate, or warming conditions. So I think what this means is that it's going to be a very haphazard sort of response. And again, it's not going to be communities that are going to respond holistically and have the potential to move to suitable habitats. It's going to be sort of piecemeal as to what might make it and what might not. And I think that's a really scary thought.
Joe Woodruff from Payne's Prairie asks, do you think there's an ethical case for intervening with breeding or genetic modification to preserve native plant populations that otherwise cannot adapt fast enough to the changing climate?
Boy, that is a really tough question, isn't it? If of course, I guess one way that people often will think about this is what are the causes? What are the proximal causes of the problem? And if it's something that's like clearly identified as a human-induced problem, like an introduced species or something that's carrying a disease, then trying to do whatever is necessary to protect that, might be warranted. On the other hand, all of these changes are human-induced. I mean, are there any areas on our planet that are actually free of human impact in one way or another? And so, in some respects, we're responsible for all of the problems that our native ecosystems face. And if that's the case, does that mean we actually have the obligation to try to fix everything? I don't have confidence that we necessarily know how to fix everything, right? I mean, this is a big problem. And you see this time after time. It's like, oh, let's use this biocontrol thing that's going to be really safe because this will help with that problem. Well, of course, that just begins another problem. And so I think it's very hard to decide what the best path forward is. But certainly for certain species that may have um, cultural value, value other than the fact that they are a native species, which, maybe that's enough. But certainly things that have cultural value, maybe those get elevated to a different level. We certainly don't have the knowledge or resources to make those sorts of, to carry out those sorts of projects for every species that's endangered. So, yeah, it's a really difficult question.
Another question is from Amy. From a stewardship perspective, if a local municipality could prioritize one aspect that would have the biggest positive impact on native plant communities, what would you recommend?
Hmm. Well, I think a decision would probably need to take into account what is known about that region and what the sorts of threats might be. So if one knows that there are some specific invasive species that are threatening native communities, then maybe ensuring that those invasive species are restricted in their advance, maybe that would be the most important thing. For other areas, maybe they're suffering from pollinator limitation, and so doing augmentation of plants to bring in pollinators would be the most important thing. So it might be that it's more specific to a given region than a simple or than a single answer to that could be applied everywhere.
And last question, could you speak a little bit more about the depth of data that's needed for your models? For example, what can we include on iNaturalist that can help you with modeling?
Oh, wow. Great question. Yes. So one of the things that's been a bit of a problem with herbarium specimens, and the herbarium specimen record is amazing. So it goes back because people have been making specimens for up to 400 years. The global herbarium collections are really fantastic, particularly for areas like Europe, parts of North America, and so on. But there's been much less collecting done over the last half century or so. And so we don't necessarily know where species are currently distributed. We know where they were maybe distributed in larger numbers up to maybe, the 1970s or 80s. And this is where iNaturalist has become really, really valuable at giving us much more recent occurrences because who doesn't love to go out and take pictures of plants while they're out walking around? And so if you then submit those to iNat, you end up really contributing to this vast amount of potential botanical information that can be used in these models. One of the things though that happens is that everybody goes to the same place, or we have our favorite hiking trails that we go on repeatedly. And so we have really good data for very few regions of like where people hike or where people walk. And so having a lot more information from areas off the beaten path would be really, really valuable. So if you like to hike and you like to do iNat, it would be really great to get off the main trails and go sort of behind the scenes and snap some photos so that there's more information about where plants are occurring today. Don't we all have random plant pictures on our phones?
For sure we do. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Soltis. Really appreciate your time. And, um, it's for me personally, it's opened up my eyes to some topics that I hadn't thought about before. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thanks a lot, and good luck to all of you in this program. I think it sounds amazing, and the rest of the topics all for the whole series look really great too. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Everybody give a round of applause. I guess we can go like this.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Let's see. All right. So very quickly, let's talk about what's coming up next. Next week, same time, we're going to be focusing on Florida's ecosystems and natural communities with Dr. Tom Hochter from the University of Florida. As with last time, the recordings and resources will be on our course information page. I will be sending an email with that URL with the website and the password. I'm going to start doing that on all of my correspondence with you just to make it more easily accessible so you don't have to go back to that welcome email I sent a while ago. Hopefully that'll help. Thank you, Beth, for that suggestion. Please complete the Module 2 learning reflection and feedback form before our next session. Um, again, use the same Zoom link for all of our modules, and I'll send a reminder email about an hour before each session. But thanks again to all of you for attending and your commitment to Florida native plants. I'm excited for what we're learning together. We're all learning. And so I hope you have a great evening and thanks again for attending.